Started. Okay, so it's 1:15. Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa, and today I'll be talking about stakeholder relationships. A lot of the designers that I speak to, this is always a bit of a challenge, really getting to know your stakeholders. So in this talk, I'm hoping to share some tips and tricks of how you can help relate to your stakeholders more and have better relationships and really create that influence in the organization that you work in. So before we get into it, a little bit about me. So I'm Vanessa, as most of you know. I currently am a global director of UX at Dye & Durham. So Dye & Durham is a legal tech company based in Canada, but we've also got a presence in the UK, Australia, South Africa, and of course Canada. And the way I describe myself is ultimately a design leader, but also speaker, but ultimately a problem solver. And the aim of why I do what I do and why I speak and why I'm speaking to you today is really to give you all the hacks that I've had to learn the hard way. So hopefully this is a shortcut to some of my years' experience that you're getting today. So why this topic? Why do we think creating influence is so important? And I always kind of think about this. There's always like ever a topic that always comes up when you're speaking to designers. And I think one of the issues that we tend to have is designers undervalued a lot in organizations. Designers are usually seen as creatives. We're the ones that brought in to make things look pretty, to create these screens, and I always find with designers, depending on your organization, you're kind of brought in at the end. You're not really brought into those early conversations. And essentially what happens is you're a little bit outnumbered, right? So you're often in teams where you're the only designer. There's pressure around quick delivery. And then there's always these metrics that we have to hit and we have to get our heads around. And what happens is you end up in this kind of, I like to call it a this is fine kind of situation where you're not really doing the full breadth of the skill set that you have as designers. We're just doing a really thin slice. And because you've just done you delivered what you needed to deliver, it's kind of fine. But is it really? And I think the key to this and the key to get out of the burning building is influence, right? How do we create that influence so we can get into the conversations a lot earlier? How can we understand our stakeholder? How can we create an understanding of our stakeholders so we can influence them? And I think the key thing with influence is it's something that's built over time. And we need to kind of strategically think in order to create that influence. And that means for us as designers to really think about the future. So not just think about the now and the next, thinking about that later and using our design skills to help provide clarity for the future. Like how can we really shape the future using our design skills? So what does that actually mean in a practical kind of sense? Um, so it means really thinking about how does this help with the team mission? So how can what you're doing help with that team achieving that team mission? Really thinking about using your design skills again to create North Star designs, but also validating that with users to get some data. And once you have that data and that information, you can then use those insights to help shape opportunities. Because a lot of the time I find when I'm speaking to users, and I'm pretty sure you all do, is you'll find that there's some kind of opportunity that the company is not looking at, the business is not looking at, and it comes from directly speaking to the customers. And then you as a designer can really use your design skills to help shape that and to help visualize that as well. But the challenge for us really is to expand our influence to different parts of the organization. not just within the product org. I like to describe myself as a person who likes to really get out there and think about other departments that I can collaborate with. So I'm always trying to collaborate with sales, customer service, marketing as well. And part of that is really trying to expand my influence. And part of it is really for me to help them understand how I can use my skills to help them. So then what we end up doing is shifting from becoming from becoming a designer who just designs screens to then becoming a designer who is critical to the organization, really critical to what the organization does and the way it functions. But the good news for us is we can use a lot of our design skills that we already know to change that narrative and to create influence. So that was a bit of an intro, but what are we actually going to cover today? So the talk's divided into three sections. So the first section is about knowing your stakeholders. So who are these people? How do they operate? How do they tick? I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for that. Then once we know our stakeholders, how do we then communicate with them? What is the language that we need to be using to speak to our stakeholders? And then the third bit is now we know them, we know how to communicate with them. How do we then collaborate with them and get them involved in that design process so they have more understanding about what we do and design? So the first bit always starts with people. Organizations are essentially a bunch of people doing a job or different jobs. And I think especially for designers and you having those department champions are really key because those are the people who are advocating for you when you're not in the room. So when they're having those meetings about new initiatives, they're able to say, actually we should get design involved in this because this designer really helped me on this project and they're really key to that. I think we need to pull them in. So my question to everyone here, and it's just kind of not a philosophical question, but a question to kind of ask yourselves, is who are your stakeholders? And I think the other bit is how well do you know your stakeholders? And my follow-up question to that is, do you know them as well as you know your users? Because you should know them as intimately as we know our users. You should know what makes them tick, and you should also know how do they influence design decisions. How much influence do they have on your day to day? And once you've done that, the next part of it is to really, so what I like to do is just write a list of all your stakeholders, but the next part of that is to create a map and really understand how influential they are and come up with a kind of strategy around creating influence. So how do we do that? What does that look like? So there's loads of stakeholder maps online, but this is the one that I like to kind of use. So for the vertical axes, you've got high influence to low influence. So the people in the organization who have a lot of influence go at the top, and then the people who don't have as much influence in the organization, they're mapped at the bottom. And then on the horizontal axis, you've got not friendly and then friendly. And I like to say friendliness because it's really just their understanding of design. So how much do they understand design versus how much they don't understand design. And the two areas that you want to focus on is the top two purple areas. So the people who already get design and are high influential, they're going to be your champions, and you're going to use these champions to advocate for you to help persuade those people who don't really get design but are high influence that we need to shift to the right. And you're going to do that by stories and case studies and examples of how you worked with other stakeholders and how you've influenced them to help educate those stakeholders who don't really understand design. In that bottom bit of the diagram where you've got people who get design but they're low influence, so those people are typically engineers or product people that you work with. Those people you want to use as on the ground champions. So they're the ones who's really going to be talking about this great user testing session that we've had, this validation session, making sure that they really understand the design process, but also are advocates of it as well. So that's the first part. We know our stakeholders, we've mapped them, we've kind of identified the ones that we really need to focus on getting to know and understand. The next part of that is stakeholder personas. So we're really using our design skills that we already have for these activities, but it doesn't have to be as exhaustive as this example. But essentially, what I wanted to show is the four main areas that you want to write down. So the first one is really about motivation. So it's what makes the stakeholder tick. Why do they do what they do? Why are they interested in what they're interested in? What are their goals in from a professional perspective? What are their priorities? Maybe there's some personal motivations as well. What are the goals of their department? You want to write some of this stuff down because that kind of gets you understanding the person, and really what drives that person. The next aspect of it is their relationship to the design process. So that's building on that friendliness element. So do they understand design? Have they worked with designers before? Maybe this is the first time they're working with a designer, so that means there's a lot of effort that you need to put in that education kind of process. But also you might have people that really get design, have worked with designers, but have worked with designers in a very specific way, and you almost want to change that dynamic. Again, write that down and then come up with a bit of a plan of how you can change that. The third aspect is the engagement strategy. So it's really about, how do you. Oh, I think we're going to try and do that, if we can, Vanya. I can see that in the chat. We'll see if we can move the image. So sorry. So the next part is, engagement strategy, and that's really about how do you engage with the stakeholder, right? So what key language do they talk about? What resonates with them? Are they a visual person? Are they a person that has a short attention span? All of those things you want to kind of write in there, because again that helps shape how you communicate with them. The other part is buy-in tactics. So this area is really, really important, right? So it's those strategies. What strategies do you need to have, or you need to employ to be able to speak to this person, right? So is it a state we all have those stakeholders that have really, really strong opinions and do sketches and wireframes. If they are a creative kind of stakeholder and feels that they have the idea, that's someone who's perfect for an ideation session, and you need to get them involved early to really understand their perspective. It might be someone who's disinterested in visuals and doesn't really care, and they're all about data. Again, you want to write that in there because that informs your approach. So now we've got all this. We know, how well we know them and how well they understand design. Now we've got a bit of a persona of what makes them tick and how we approach that. So the next part of it is how do we communicate with them and how do we make sure that we're visible? Which takes me on to that second point, communication and visibility. And communication and visibility go pretty much hand in hand, I would say. Um, Communication is really about understanding your stakeholders' needs. So really building on that stakeholder persona as much as you can. So thinking about what are your stakeholders' communication preferences, how often should you communicate with them? So depending on how senior they are, you're going to communicate with them slightly differently, right? So as an example, I report into the CPO. I speak to, the CPO regularly, but I don't speak to the CEO as regularly. I speak to them, maybe, once a month, once every 2 months. And then you've got types of communication as well. So, as an example, my CPO, who I report into, he's not really a fan of voice notes and videos. I love a voice note and a video, but he is not a fan of that. He is more of a diagram type person. So a lot of my communication needs to be quite diagrammatical and quite visual, but can't really do videos, can't really do voice notes. So I shape my communication based on what their preferences is and based on what makes them tick. So I'm always kind of thinking about this when I'm speaking to different people. And the next part of that slice is really visibility, right? So it's highlighting your value. And the thing with visibility is really thinking about things that you can create, that makes it easy for people to see what you're doing without you putting on so much effort. So it's creating dashboards, reports, success stories as well. So remember those case studies that I talked about, creating case studies and making them really visual, so that you can share that and make it really shareable. So you could just do a kind of story, of here's the problem, here's how we solved it, here's the impact. You can package that up and put it on Slack or put it on Teams so that people can actually just watch it, and you can spread that around the whole business. So think about things like that. The other thing is thinking about those meaningful metrics that you can establish over time. Also think about those cost and time savings. A lot of the time as designers, we don't really talk about what we didn't do because we validated it with customers and customers said that this wasn't a good idea. So we decided not to build it. Instantly, that's saving a business a lot of money because development costs a lot. So really think about these stories that you can collect and you can share widely. And it's really simple. It's like things like doing a design newsletter, highlights at the end of the week, dashboards, like I said, webinars. So at my organization, we do quite a lot of webinars, about UX and personas as well. So really think about those opportunities that you can do to really spread the word around design and the design process, and influence those stakeholders, as they move around the business. So, because I like a bit of a framework, here is a bit of a framework of how to communicate with, your stakeholders. So, the first one is really about that business impact. So, really think about what you're working on and what is the impact of that. So, what are the savings that you've made? Are there any improvements from a time to market perspective? So, how quickly it went to market? When you're thinking about that user experience, think about those metrics that you can pull out, and even those quotes that you can pull out from your user testing and, speaking to users, right? So you've got consistency metrics, user satisfaction. So if your company is doing NPS or anything like that, always pull those as well. Think about task completion. If you're, in a B2B organization and it's quite difficult to speak to customers, you can actually think about how quickly, you've been able to complete the customer's been able to complete the task. Reduction of errors as well is another one that you can start thinking about. So how can you create these into metrics, but also how can you create a story where you're talking about these aspects? And then you've got the technical benefits, right? So if you're talking to a technical stakeholder, really think about how you can talk to them. Things like reduce technical debt, reduction in handover time. Maybe it's a reduction in coding time, which means that they can, go through more tickets. So it's really just thinking quite smart in the way you approach things, and almost catering a conversation to the people you're talking to. And then you've got design and brand benefits. So if you're speaking to a marketing person, think about brand consistency, reduction in handover time, um, those how consistent the is to roll out the campaign. So things like that, things that marketing people care about, amp that up. So another example that I wanted to show is narrative building blocks. So this again is super useful. So if you, if say for example you are presenting to a stakeholder, this is the way to almost present the problem and to walk through what your design and your problem. So you first want to start with a problem statement. So what is the problem that we set out to, solve? And then you want to talk about that business impact. So why are we tackling this problem? We're tackling this problem because it's going to cost the business X amount of money. And then what is the evidence of that? So it could be user evidence, but it also could be, some other evidence as well. Um, and then after you've set up the scene, you then want to talk about your this solution. So talk through your design solution. So how have you gone about solving the problem? And you also want to sprinkle in, when you're talking about your design solution, you want to sprinkle in things like, your evidence from customers where you validated it. So any quotes that you have, you can add those in. And then lastly, well, second to last, you want to talk about those success metrics, right? So how are you going to measure success? How do we know that the thing that we've designed is going to be successful? What are the targets attached to that? And then the last bit is really about risk assessment. So are there any risks for this? So this is really important if you're working, say for example, in like a consumer area, but there's loads of other risks, right? You might be working on something to do with checkout. So the risk is that people might not check out, for example. So you want to highlight those risks, but you also want to talk about how you're going to mitigate some of these issues that are going to come up. And I think one of the things when you're thinking about communication is good communication is the bridge between confusion and clarity. So we really want to make sure that we're really leaning into that communication and communicating as clear as possible. But also if you're a design with design, we can use our visuals, right? So think about how you can use your visual skills to help that communication and make it a lot easier, less ambiguous. So now we know our stakeholders, we know how to communicate with them. So now it's like, how do we actually work with them and how do we collaborate with them? So the last bit is about collaboration, right? Collaboration is really important. One, because it allows others to see your perspective. It allows others to really understand the design process. And it gets people involved in that design process as well. A lot of times in organizations, I hear from stakeholders that they don't understand discovery, they don't necessarily understand how you got to a solution as well. And collaborating allows you to demystify some of that design process. Just to show also, going back to what I said, that it's not just about we're creatives and we're creating screens. There's actually some science in there. There's a methodology in there. There's a reason why we do things the way we're doing it. We're not just doing it for the sake of doing it. So when you're thinking about collaboration, think about how can you collaborate with your stakeholders. Um, so there might be different kind of activities that you want to do with those collaborations. So with a research team I was managing, what we did is we created a collaborative workshop where we actually formed the brief. We were very cognizant that these stakeholders didn't have that much time, so we literally kept it down to 30 minutes, and we got a whole load of information from them that we were able to shape the project. So we're getting those stakeholders involved really early. So again, think about those activities, but also think about what activities you can do with them, right? There's some activities that stakeholders are really receptive to, but there's others that some might not be. Also think about when in the design process should you get them involved. Earlier I mentioned some of those more creative stakeholders who already know the solution and have given you a wireframe. You can those stakeholders, they're the ones that you want to get involved early, but you also want to bring in people like engineers in those kind of sessions as well to help pull out feasibility and have those healthier discussions. And really, collaboration is about taking people along the journey. So, really think about, like I just said, those key collaboration sessions and have them throughout that design process. So, have them as check ins throughout the design process. A thing that I really like doing and helps build that influence quite a lot is pairing with non-designers during the design process. Again, this helps create advocates and champions for you because they end up understanding the why behind what you're doing. They understand that user perspective as well and the user insight. And also they start thinking about the user as well. A lot of the time when I've got engineers involved in user interviews and user testing, we end up having a conversation around, oh, but the user said this, this, and this. Should we tackle this? And then you end up having this collaboration partner, and you spend a lot less time persuading people and more time actually creating great solutions. And then the last one is pair with PMs earlier. I think this is really key when they're thinking about initiatives, when they're thinking and shaping those stories and those epics. Really try and work with them and understand, well, what is it we're trying to achieve, and also is there any insights that can help support some of this stuff. Again, it helps you become a bit more strategic and you're thinking ahead. So I've got a few examples as well, not an exhaustive list, but most of you kind of know these types of sessions, right? So you've got sketching sessions, crazy eights, empathy mapping. A lot of these things are things that we do as designers in design teams, but really think about how you can pull in some of your stakeholders into these sessions as well and adapt them as well. Recently I did a journey mapping workshop and it was all with the stakeholders. So you can adapt some of these workshops and bring in some of these wider stakeholders to help you shape your product, but also to help create influence as well. So wrapping up, I've got a few key takeaways. I'm really keen to get into the chat and some of the questions. So one of the key things is to really adapt your communication to your stakeholder. So think about the stakeholder you're talking to, think about their motivations, and shape the conversation around that. The second part is to connect design decisions to those business outcomes. So again, the key to cracking that stakeholder code is to really know the business outcomes and be able to link that, so it doesn't just feel like you've just created this design. There's a reason why. And then the third part is make design collaborative, not isolating. I want to leave you with this. So the key to cracking the stakeholder code is to really know them deeply, and so you can adapt your conversations to creating that influence. And that's me. So thank you very much. Feel free to add me to LinkedIn. I've got questions in the chat that I want to go through. One from Francesca, so I'll read this. What's one method you use to quickly identify who the real power brokers are in a project beyond the org chart? That's a really good question, actually. I think one of the key things is actually thinking about meetings. If you have meetings and the person who's always talking, or the person that ends up being that decision maker, they're usually the key person. The other thing that I like to do is have interviews with, once you've identified on the org chart certain people, have interviews with those people and then ask questions around, okay, who else do I speak to? Who's really influential? You'll find there's probably a couple of names that keep coming up that you know you need to speak to and you know you need to get buy-in with. Okay, another question. Building one-on-one is possible, but how do you scale that influence when you're dealing with dozens of stakeholders across multiple initiatives? Really good question. I think one of the things to do, especially if you're in big organizations, and I have this now and I had it in my previous organization, is you really need to start with one stakeholder. Start with that one stakeholder, build that relationship with them, and this is where you start using them as your champion. So use that story that you have, how you've helped them, to help have those conversations with those other stakeholders. What we did when I was at Kazoo is every quarter we had OKRs, new OKRs. What we actually did is we would speak to every stakeholder, like have a 15-minute, 20-minute conversation with them to really understand what their needs are and what they're thinking about in that quarter. And then what we did is we decided who we can actually help with a research project or a project, but also who are other people that we can't really help them now, but we'll keep them in mind. So you're still keeping that relationship, but really you can't really help them because it's not going to make an impact. So I think about those kind of things. It's all about being smart, but there's some stakeholders that you just that maybe doesn't make sense for you to get to know, just because they're so far from design and working on design. Hopefully that helps. Okay, we've got from Ben. How do you uncover the rich information you showed in the stakeholder personas when you have extremely limited time with each individual? Sometimes only 20 minutes, even if it's an hour, even that hour has been promised you. Really good question. What I would do, Ben, is think about key questions that you need to ask them, right? So there's questions like, what keeps you up at night? That helps you understand their motivations. Really observe the language that they're saying and they're talking about. Also, don't be afraid to ask them, what are your key metrics that you're observing? What are your OKRs? do you have any dashboards or data? Like ask them for that and get them to share those things with you, because by doing that you're able to create a bit of a frame. I think the richness of the persona will happen over time. So I think you just want some instances to fill that in, and then over time as you interact with them, you'll start fleshing that out a little bit more. Okay, we've got Lena. Love the key takeaways. Do you have more recommendations on making the communication clear? Um, Super challenging. I think my key thing is always to make it as visual as possible and unambiguous. I lean a lot on, so I work in a global company, so we've got people in Australia, people in Canada, all over the place. So I do a lot of videos. So videos are great because you kind of can't, I feel like it's very clear. You can make it visual as well by sharing a PowerPoint, a relatively unambiguous. I think also you're able to understand the tone of things as well versus writing something in Teams. Sometimes Teams you can't really understand someone's tone or sense of humor. So videos are really good, but I think if you can make things as visual as possible with diagrams and things like that, it almost makes things as unambiguous as possible. Hopefully that helps. And yeah, I think that's it for questions. And I think I'm at time. So thank you everyone who's listened. Really enjoyed the session. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And yeah, happy to talk and chat about stakeholders. Thank you so much.